President Donald Trump, nearing the end of what has been an extraordinary day of his arrival in Israel, meeting with hostage families, and then going to Sharm el-Sheikh to sign an agreement, the details of which are still unclear to us, but surrounded, as he rightfully said, by some people who may not always get along, but also who didn't always get along with him. Just talk about tariffs, for example. There were world leaders standing next to him with whom he has had an occasionally difficult relationship. But today, they are joined in a common cause to celebrate the release of the 20 final hostages being held by Hamas. Richard Haass is still with me, along with Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Diplomacy and Public Affairs and NBC News Senior Executive Editor for National Security, David Rohde. Rick, so now he talks about the Board of Peace, the meetings that will continue, the number of countries that want to be involved in this. Could this do some good?
Absolutely, Chris. I mean, we've been talking about this all day, and I've been trying to think of, is there a unified field theory of Trump's diplomacy? Because so much that's happened today, traditional diplomats are appalled or surprised that nothing has been ironed out, nothing has been agreed to, because you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. But Trump's strategy is the exact opposite. If you overpromise, people will have to deliver. What he has done is put the cart before the horse. There's absolutely no peace agreement. There's a ceasefire. There's no understanding of how Gaza will be ruled. There's no understanding of what the international force will be. There's no understanding of how the finance will be. And by the way, the Board of Peace, which could do some good, nobody knows what that is except the name. But Trump's gamble is, if he promises this, if he says there's peace in our time, that people will be bought into it and will have to try to contribute to that.
So let's talk a little bit about the reality on the ground, David, which we heard the president both when he was speaking in front of the Knesset and then later when he came to Egypt, talk about how many people there with so much money. He didn't think there had ever been a gathering of so many powerful people who are personally that rich. It will take a tremendous amount of money to even think about rebuilding Gaza. Let me give you some of the latest statistics, many of them provided by the UN. 61 million tons of debris need to be cleaned up across the territory. That's equivalent of 25 Eiffel Towers by volume. 700,000 people were displaced. As we know, the huge cost of life, 67,000 plus Palestinians who were killed. And just when you think about the starvation that is going on there, not to mention the profound medical problems that are not being addressed. Gaza's vegetation is largely gone. 97% of tree crops gone, 95% of shrubs, and 82% of their annual crops are gone. How do you even begin?
We don't have any details. I'm going to riff off of the same thing you have, that there are a lot of wealthy people there, and it is this Trumpian strategy of sort of announcing the deal when you don't have any of the details worked out.
They're here, so they're going to give us money.
But the one immediate danger to even beginning that reconstruction is the fact that, you know, Hamas is there. Will Hamas disarm? I mean, there were reports of Hamas killing other Palestinians just in the few hours since Israeli troops have left. And that's this key question, and it's really up to, I would say, three countries, Egypt and Turkey and Qatar. Can they pressure and convince Hamas's leadership to actually disarm? Because until they disarm and there's some stability there, some sort of this international peacekeeping force, you know, reconstruction won't be possible. It's a huge step forward that so many trucks are going into Gaza, that the starvation that was occurring in some pockets has ended. People are able to move back to Gaza City, and it's just a huge step forward for the 2 million people of Gaza. But will it last? And we just don't know.
And when you talk about Richard Haass, Egypt and Turkey and Qatar being able to potentially put some pressure on Hamas, what's in it for them? What would make them want to disarm?
What's in it for these three countries, or what's in it for Hamas?
No, what's in it for Hamas? Why would they want to disarm? What would encourage them to disarm?
Well, I don't think they will disarm. What they might do, though, is lie low. What I would imagine that Hamas's strategy would be to say they're disarming, or at least in part, to give up some token arms, to stash away others, and to play for time. Their goal is to maintain or, where possible, increase influence in both Gaza as well as the West Bank, either through their appeal or more likely through intimidation. That tends to be Hamas's style. They may not want a confrontation with an Arab stabilization force, but maybe they might. They may actually try to intimidate that from coming into existence. It's not clear if the Arab countries are prepared to put soldiers into a force that essentially where people are going to take casualties. This is not a peacekeeping situation unless Hamas changes its stripes. This is a peacemaking situation, far more dangerous. So again, Hamas is not looking to become irrelevant, either militarily or politically, and we shouldn't kid ourselves. Let me make one larger point, Chris, and it's consistent with what you and Rick and David are saying. When I used to teach, we used to say that 90% of life is implementation. Well, here it might be about 98% of life. You've got a very vague general 20-point plan. You've got some vision. You've got some goodwill, and we've now got a little bit of momentum. Some important things were accomplished with the hostage return, with the ceasefire and the like. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. We are looking at years and years and years of disciplined follow-up. There's going to be setbacks, and you still don't have partners to work with on any side, either Israeli or Palestinian. So again, I just think it's important on this day where we should feel good and celebrate the freedom of these individuals and the ceasefire. We've also got to just mix it with an awful lot of sobriety and realism. This is going to be a slog. I don't know any other word for it. And it's actually going to take not just the remaining 3 years of this Trump administration, but years after that. This is a long, difficult process of building trust, rebuilding Gaza, building the capabilities of Palestinians to self-govern in the West Bank. So no one should underestimate all that lies ahead while they still feel very good about what has been accomplished.
When you look, David, at what Hamas did today, releasing the 20 hostages, we also got word just a few minutes ago from IDF that the bodies of 4 of the deceased hostages have been turned over, and we know that process will get underway. But what is there left of Hamas? What is the leadership? Is there leadership to have a strategy for how they would move forward?
That's a great question, because we don't know who is left. Is there anyone who's a powerful enough leader to get them to disarm, or will Hamas fragment? And then we have another sort of element of chaos and all this. I don't honestly want to be too negative, given how much suffering has occurred, first in Israel on October 7th, and then over the last 2 years in Gaza. But the key thing is going to be follow through here from the Trump administration. And the president will leave, and we'll just see if Jared Kushner and Witkoff can make this happen. But it is a.
If you were a betting man?
I think they can if they can continue this momentum. To the credit of the president, the threat of tariffs and the Trumpian form of diplomacy has caused these leaders to sit here and do what he wants, to appear in these events. Will they actually follow up with actions or not? But it is a decisive use of American power. I've had friends of mine who cover the region say they saw a hesitance to use American power in the Biden administration. And the question is, will he use it in a way that actually delivers an actual peace agreement?
Well, he certainly got a lot of praise from a lot of leaders, even calling him up to the podium to say, what was that you told me before? Feel free to, praise me more publicly. Having said that, he has been very generous over today and frankly, since we first learned that the hostages will be released in sharing the credit for who was part of the negotiating team, with praising, for example, Arab leaders. Having said that, he looks energized. He looks like somebody who knows that he got something done that had eluded others. So I wonder, going forward, if that will also impact the way he deals with other foreign policy, number one, and in specific, apparently he's going to meet with Zelensky at the White House on Friday, and he's already talking about, well, maybe Tomahawk missiles are, on the agenda. Could he go after Putin in a way we haven't seen before? What's the big picture of how you think an energized and, in his mind, incredibly successful foreign policy president uses this moving forward?
Chris, that's a great question, and we don't know the answer to it. And to David's point about not wanting to be downbeat on such an extraordinary day, we'll have to see. I mean, if this makes him more generous with allies and adversaries than he was before, great. What we saw today is something we see at every cabinet meeting that he has, is that the kind of genuflecting before him and praising him beforehand elicits a better response. If that's what it takes for diplomacy, then that's what world leaders will do, and maybe it will have a beneficial effect. He wants to be a peacemaker. He doesn't actually know the details. There's always an advantage sometimes of not knowing the history of conflicts, which he doesn't seem to know. But if he wants to be a peacemaker and he can enlist the help of other countries, the wealthy nations, that would be a great thing.